In the winter of 1847, a rescue party forced their way into a cluster of half-buried cabins high in the Sierra Nevada and walked straight into a nightmare. Snowdrifts were taller than houses. Inside, they found men, women, and children so starved they could barely stand. And evidence that sometime before those rescuers arrived, the line between we live and we die had been crossed in a way no one wanted to admit. Later on, newspapers would give them a name that still makes people flinch: the Donner Party. Most people think they know this story. Oh yeah, that's the wagon train that got trapped and turned to cannibalism. But the horror of the Donner Party isn't just that starving families ate the dead, it's how they ended up there. One bad decision, one arrogant guidebook, one shortcut through the desert that slowly stripped away their time, their food, and their options long before the first snowflake hit their tents. In this video, we're going to walk that road with them. From hopeful departure on a sunny spring morning in Missouri, to the brutal shortcut that wasn't, to the moment when snow closed behind them like a door. We'll sit in those dark cabins, listen to the wind, bury the camp deeper every night, and follow the rescue parties who arrived just in time, for some. And along the way, we're going to look at the question most versions skip over. At what point did survival stop being a plan and start being a horror story? So, tuck yourself in, turn the lights low, and imagine you're in a wagon pointed toward California with no idea that you've already left safety behind. This is the true, slow-burn nightmare of the Donner Party. How ordinary families, chasing a better life, ended up snowbound on the wrong side of the mountains, staring at the people they loved and realizing there was nothing left to eat but the dead. Part 1. In the winter of 1847, a rescue party forced their way into a cluster of half-buried cabins high in the Sierra Nevada and walked into a scene they would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. Snowdrifts were taller than houses, pressing up against roofs and doors like frozen waves. Inside they found men, women, and children who were so thin their faces almost didn't look human anymore. The air smelled like smoke, sickness, and something else they all recognized but didn't want to name. By the time they stumbled back down the mountain, the whole country would know the survivors by one phrase: the Donner Party. Most people think they already know this story. That's the wagon train that got trapped and turned to cannibalism, they'll say, like it's a single, ugly sentence in a history book. But the horror of the Donner Party didn't start in those dark cabins. It began months earlier in choices that looked smart and hopeful at the time. One guidebook, one shortcut, one more day, lost here and there. By the time the first snowflake hit their tents, most of the damage had already been done. This is how they walked themselves to the edge of that winter without realizing what they were trading away. In the spring of 1846, California sounded less like a place and more like a cheat code. Newspapers back east were full of breathless descriptions: soil so rich you could practically drop seeds and walk away, mild winters, and fields of grain glowing like gold under a gentle sun. For families stuck on crowded farms in Illinois and Missouri, that sounded like a ticket out of a life where you mostly just got tired. All you needed was a wagon, a team of oxen, and enough faith to point your whole life west and just start walking. People sold land, packed everything they thought they'd need, and told themselves they could handle whatever the trail threw at them. Among them were two brothers, George and Jacob Donner, both in their 60s but still strong, with wives and children who trusted them completely. Traveling alongside them was James Reed, a younger, ambitious businessman with a polished wagon and big dreams about how important he might be in a brand new California. They weren't outlaws or soldiers. They were ordinary families with feather beds tied into wagons and Bibles tucked carefully into trunks. When they rolled out of Independence, Missouri, in May, they weren't characters in a horror story. They were just people who believed hard work and courage could beat distance and luck. The first weeks on the trail felt exactly like the adventure they'd imagined. The wagons joined the main stream of emigrants on the Oregon Trail, a long, dusty river of people moving west. Every day had the same rhythm. Yoke the oxen at dawn, walk beside the wagons all day, set up camp near a creek or river at night. There were broken wheels, stubborn animals, and the occasional scare when a child wandered too far, but nothing the group couldn't fix with tools, patience, and a few sharp words. Campfires at night brought music, gossip, and plans for what they'd build when they finally reached the Pacific. Out there on the plains, the trail felt comforting in its predictability. Deep ruts showed where thousands of wagons had gone before them, like grooves in a record. But those same ruts also meant congestion, traffic jams at river crossings, dust in your teeth, and the constant feeling that you were stuck in someone else's line. It was around then that the whispers started spreading from fire to fire, carried by eager hands holding a slim little book. The author was Lansford Hastings, and his guidebook promised that there was a faster way to California, his way. Hastings' route, the Hastings Cutoff, was supposed to shave off hundreds of miles by cutting south of the Great Salt Lake instead of following the older, safer path. He described it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. The awkward truth was that he'd never actually taken a full wagon train over it. Reed read the book and saw opportunity, fewer crowds, less dust, and maybe an earlier arrival that would let him plant roots in California faster than his competitors. Around the Donner campfires, the idea of a shortcut felt like someone had just opened a secret door in a maze. Not everyone believed the sales pitch. At one point on the trail, Reed met a mountain man and explorer named James Kleiman, who had actually seen part of Hastings's proposed route. Kleiman warned him flat out, "Don't take it. The mountains and desert are worse than the book admits, and it will cost you time, not save it." It was the kind of advice you only get from someone who doesn't have anything to gain by lying. But Reed and others had already fallen in love with the idea of being cleverer and faster than the main herd. Warnings from a dusty frontiersman were no match for the clean, confident sentences in a printed book. By late July, the Donner Reed group rolled into Fort Bridger, a trading post in what's now Wyoming. Hastings himself wasn't there, but he'd left word and notes encouraging emigrants to take his cutoff. The fort's owners, who stood to benefit from traffic on the new route, didn't exactly talk anyone out of it. At that fork in the trail, most wagons continued on the established path north. The Donner Party, along with a handful of others, turned south toward a landscape no heavily loaded emigrant train had ever tried to drag itself through. In that moment, with the sun overhead and the children still laughing, it probably felt bold, maybe even smart. The Wasatch Mountains hit them like a brick wall. Instead of a gentle, well-worn wagon track, they found dense forests, steep slopes, and narrow ravines barely wide enough for a single wagon, let alone an entire train. Progress slowed to a crawl. Men spent their days hacking crude roads out of tangled brush and rock, then staggering back to camp so exhausted they could barely chew. Some days they moved only a mile or two. Every foot forward cost sweat, broken tools, and yet another chunk of the precious time they thought they'd saved with the shortcut. The party had to double and triple teams of oxen to drag wagons up impossible inclines, then fight gravity and fear to lower them down the other side. Axes chipped at roots, wheels crunched over stones Hastings had never mentioned. Tempers frayed. Children who had been promised an adventure now watched their parents argue in hoarse voices after dark, blaming Hastings, blaming each other, blaming the kind of bad luck that feels personal when you're tired. By the time they finally clawed their way out of the Wasatch, everyone knew the cutoff was costing them, but no one knew exactly how much they'd already paid. Waiting for them beyond the mountains was a wide, pale lie, the Great Salt Lake Desert. On a map, it looked flat and harmless, In reality, it was a blistering, waterless expanse of salt-crusted ground that turned into a mirror for the sun. The Donner Party pushed out onto it anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The first day, the heat came up from the ground as strongly as it beat down from the sky. The second day, the animals began to falter, tongues swollen, legs trembling under the weight of the wagons. By the third day, the desert stopped feeling like an obstacle and started feeling like something that actively wanted them dead. As the oxen staggered and dropped, the families faced choices that felt like small betrayals of the life they'd imagined. Wagons were lightened, then abandoned altogether. Heavy furniture was tossed out onto the salt and left behind, legs sticking up into the sky like broken bones. Trunks full of dishes, quilts and keepsakes bounced out of wagons and lay, cracked in the glare, objects that had been treasures back home, turning into meaningless junk under the desert sun. Parents watched their children's favorite toys disappear into the shimmering distance, telling them, "We'll get better ones in California," while secretly wondering if they'd ever see California at all. When they finally reached water again, the relief was laced with something sour. They hadn't just lost things, they'd lost weeks. The cattle that survived were gaunt and far less useful than before. The party had burned through more food than they'd planned while crawling through the Wasatch and stumbling across the salt. Now, when they rejoined the main California trail, the other wagon trains were gone. No moving camps dotted the path ahead, no fellow travelers to share news or supplies. The Donner Party trudged into emptier country with fewer resources and a calendar that had quietly flipped closer to winter. The stress of the trail had also cracked something inside the group. Arguments that would once have blown over now turned violent. In October, near what's now Nevada, a dispute between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder exploded on a narrow stretch of trail. Whips were raised, blows traded, oxen panicked. In the chaos, Reed stabbed Snyder with a knife. Snyder died. The wagon train, already on edge, held something like a trial on the open ground and decided Reed had to go. They banished him to ride ahead alone instead of hanging him, sending away one of their most experienced men, just as the hardest part of the journey loomed. As the party pushed on, the land began to tilt upward. The air grew sharper, nights colder, and distant peaks started to show streaks of white that did not melt during the day. They were approaching the Sierra Nevada, the last major barrier between them and the Sacramento Valley. In a different year, arriving this late might still have been survivable. But 1846 was not interested in being kind. A few travelers they met on the way warned them that storms could come early, that the passes sometimes closed faster than anyone expected. The Donners and their companions listened, thanked them, and kept going. Stopping wasn't really an option anymore. They reached the area near Truckee Lake, today called Donner Lake, under a sky that looked more threatening by the hour. The plan was simple and painfully optimistic. Get over the pass quickly, drop down into lower country, and worry about everything else once the mountains were behind them. The wagons moved into the forested basin, wheels creaking, animals snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. Some families began to talk about what town they'd build their houses near, which crops they'd plant first. They were close enough to taste the end of the trail, even as the wind began to taste like snow. The first serious storm didn't give them much warning. One day, the pass ahead was a rough, steep path they thought they could still manage. The next morning, it was buried under fresh, heavy snow, so deep that oxen sank in up to their bellies. They tried anyway, hacking at drifts with shovels, beating a path with their own bodies, but each new step seemed to fill in as soon as they made it. The mountains, which had looked like a final obstacle, now behaved like a door someone had slammed shut and bolted from the other side. After hours of backbreaking work that got them nowhere, they turned the wagons back toward the lake. They built what they could with what they had. Some families crowded into rough cabins near the water, using logs and canvas and wagon parts to hold off the cold. Others, including the Donners themselves, set up a separate camp a few miles back at a place called Alder Creek, where a broken axle had forced them to stop earlier. Snow kept falling. It drifted up against walls, onto roofs, into every gap they hadn't sealed well enough. Inside the shelters, smoke from green wood fires stung eyes and throats, and the food stores were counted and recounted in tight, frightened whispers. No one knew exactly how long they'd be stuck there. None of them were ready to hear the true answer, long enough for the words Donner Party to stop meaning wagon train and start meaning something much darker. Snow didn't just fall on the Donner camps, it settled into them and stayed. It packed itself onto roofs until the cabins seemed to shrink under the weight. It drifted over paths and doorways so completely that getting outside meant crawling up through a plug of snow like someone escaping a buried grave. Inside, the light turned dim and bluish, as if the world beyond the walls had been replaced with ice. The storm that closed the pass wasn't a quick tantrum. It was the beginning of a siege. At first, people told each other this was temporary. A bad week, maybe 2, and then there would be a break in the weather, enough time to get the wagons moving again. They rationed what supplies they had: flour, bacon, beans, a little coffee, sometimes a treat like dried apples. Portions shrank quietly. A spoon that had once heaped now skimmed across the top of the barrel. Parents did back-of-the-envelope math in their heads and pretended not to see where the numbers were headed. Hunting became a lifeline. Men trudged out into the deepening snow after any sign of movement, rabbit tracks, a dark shape in the trees that might be a deer. Snowshoes were fashioned from odds and ends, crude, but better than sinking up to the waist with every step. Sometimes a party came back with meat, and for a day or two the camp felt almost normal. Pots simmering, children licking grease from their fingers, a brief, warm heaviness in everyone's stomach. More often they came back with nothing but icicles on their eyelashes and a little less strength than they'd had when they left. As November folded into December, the snowbanks around the cabins rose higher than the chimneys. Smoke had to fight its way out and lay low across the drifts in strange, thin sheets. Inside, the air turned stale and damp despite the cold, filled with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the bitter tang of burned green wood. People started to cough more. Eyes grew hollow, cheeks sunk in, and conversations got shorter, stripped down to the things that mattered: food, weather, and whether anyone had seen even a hint of a break in the sky. By then the calculations had changed. It wasn't just about waiting out a storm anymore, it was about whether anyone in those cabins could survive long enough for the snow to melt on its own. The leaders in the camp, George Donner at Alder Creek, other men near the lake, began to talk quietly about sending small groups out on foot to try to reach help. The idea sounded insane and necessary at the same time. The nearest settlements were on the far side of those mountains, days away under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. The first attempts failed in ways that left scars on morale. Small groups tried to climb back toward the pass, breaking trails through chest-deep snow, only to be turned back by drifts that might as well have been solid walls. Snowshoes broke. People fell through hidden pockets and had to be hauled out like sacks. Each time they returned, exhausted and empty-handed, the others watched them come in through the low doors with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that they were alive, dread that the outside world still might as well have been on the moon. Food ran out differently for each family. Some had brought more, some less. Some had lost supplies earlier on the trail when wagons broke or oxen died. To stretch what remained, people boiled leather, strips cut from harnesses or old shoes, trying to soften it into something they could choke down. They scraped the last bits of grease from the insides of hides and cooking pots. Anything that might give even the illusion of nourishment went into the fire or the pot. Hunger stopped being a feeling and became the background noise of every thought. The animals went next, not because anyone wanted that, but because there was no choice. Oxen and horses that had once pulled wagons toward the promise of California now became meat, stringy and tough but life-saving. The process was grimly practical. One life extended at the cost of another that had already done everything it could. Children cried when animals they'd named were led away and didn't come back, but even their grief was blunted by how empty their stomachs were. In the cabins, bones were boiled again and again until they gave up the last hint of fat. There came a point when even the animals were gone, and the only fresh meat was whatever could be hunted in the forest, which, with the snow so deep, wasn't much. That's when the conversations changed. People who had sworn they would never even think certain thoughts found those thoughts circling them anyway. They'd heard stories, of course, about shipwrecks and desperate choices in distant places. Those were always other people's nightmares. Now, in the dim light of the cabins, the question came closer. What happens if someone dies? At first, death came the way it always does in bad winters, quietly, one person at a time. A child whose body couldn't keep up with the cold, an older person weakened by the journey. Someone who caught an infection from a cut or a lungful of smoke and didn't have the strength to fight it off. The dead were wrapped and, when possible, buried in shallow graves hacked out of the frozen ground or tucked into snowbanks with a kind of desperate respect. But as the snow piled higher and the living became weaker, even that ritual became harder to perform. No one in those cabins woke up one morning and casually decided to eat a human being. It was a line they approached in increments, with arguments, tears, and the kind of silence that comes when language runs out. Some swore they would sooner die. Others stared at their children's faces and realized their own deaths would not help anyone if there was food right there, and they refused it out of principle. The first bodies used that way were those who had already died. Even then, it felt like stepping off a cliff they could never climb back up. While all this was happening, James Reed, the man they'd banished earlier, had managed to reach civilization on the far side of the mountains. He hadn't forgotten the people he left behind. In settlements down in the Sacramento Valley, he talked his way into meetings, pleaded with officials and rallied volunteers, telling them that dozens of men, women, and children were trapped in the Sierra with winter closing in. Getting a rescue party together took time. Supplies had to be gathered, routes planned, men convinced to risk their own lives for strangers. All the while, snow kept falling on the cabins near Truckee Lake and Alder Creek. Back up in the camps, no one knew help was on the way. They knew only that each day seemed colder than the last, each night longer. The sun, when it appeared at all, arced low and weak across the sky, offering light without much warmth. People slept more to escape the constant ache in their bodies, only to wake groggy and weaker. Every sound outside, a branch cracking under snow, a gust of wind, could be, for a split second, footsteps. Every time they opened the door to find only more white, the world shrank a little further. Eventually, the people strongest on their feet realized waiting was a gamble they were losing. If rescue wasn't coming, maybe they could become the rescue. A small group, later called the Forlorn Hope, began to form in whispers and then in solid plans. A handful of the fittest men and women, equipped with makeshift snowshoes and the best scraps of clothing left, would try to cross the mountains on foot and bring back help. It sounded like madness in the middle of that much snow. It also sounded like the only remaining chance anyone had of ever leaving those cabins alive. They left on a morning so bright, it almost felt like the sky was mocking them. 17 of them at first, men and women, just hardened trappers but mothers and teenagers, strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and stepped up onto drifts that had buried the world they used to recognize. They carried what little food the camps could spare, blankets, and the kind of hope that isn't really optimism so much as refusal to lie down. People left behind watched them go from doorways half buried in snow, eyes hollow, hands pressed to mouths. No one said goodbye like it might be the last time. They said it like they'd see each other in a few weeks, because the alternative was too heavy to hold. Almost immediately, the snow made itself the main character. Every step sank, even with the snowshoes, and every step that sank stole strength. Trees that looked close took hours to reach. The air was thin and so cold it felt sharp in their lungs. At night, they scraped out shallow depressions in the snow and huddled together under blankets stiff with frost, listening to the wind comb through the trees and the faint creaks and groans of the mountains under their feet. Someone tried to tell a joke one night and choked halfway through it, not because it wasn't funny, but because laughing took more air than they could spare. Within a few days, the food ran out in that way food always does in bad stories, slowly, then all at once. Rations that had already been tiny dwindled to mouthfuls, then bites, then memories of bites. They chewed leather again, this time on the move, tongues numb and cracked. Hunger reshaped their thoughts. People started lagging behind, eyes unfocused, words slurring from exhaustion and lack of calories. The group shrank, not because they wanted to leave anyone, but because they simply couldn't pull the weakest along through chest-deep snow. The first death on the trail hit them like a physical blow. A young man who had been struggling for hours finally sat down on the snow and whispered that he needed to rest. Everyone knew that rest meant something else at those temperatures. They tried to coax him up, to haul him to his feet, but his body had decided it was done. When he stopped moving, the silence that settled over the group wasn't peaceful. It was vicious, full of questions no one wanted to put into words. What now? Do we leave him here? Do we use what's left of him so that others might walk a little farther? That decision, like the ones back in the cabins, didn't come quickly or cleanly. There were arguments, tears, prayers, people turning their faces away so they wouldn't have to watch whatever was about to happen. But the math was unignorable. No food, more storms coming, miles of snow between them and the settlements they were trying to reach. In the end, desperation won out over revulsion. They did what they had already done in smaller, more secret ways back at the lake, used the dead to keep the living walking. No one felt heroic. No one ever would again. As the days blurred together, some began to lose track of time. The sun was either too bright on the snow or completely hidden, turning the world into a grey, directionless box. They were moving, but it didn't always feel like movement. It felt like being trapped in a loop of white and cold and pain. People talked to themselves, to others who weren't there, to God, to the mountains, anyone who might be listening. The group's numbers thinned further, not in a dramatic avalanche of deaths, but in ones and twos, each loss another notch carved into the already splintering edge of what they could endure. At one point they stumbled into an open space where the snow lay smoother and the trees backed off a little, giving them a view of the peaks. The sight should have crushed them. The mountains still loomed, unbothered by their tiny progress. Instead, it gave a few of them something like anger. "We are not dying out here," one woman said through cracked lips, more a growl than a sentence. That stubbornness didn't put food in their mouths, but it did push their feet forward for a few more miles when logic said they should have lain down and let the snow erase them. Back at the lake and Alder Creek, time was crawling too. Families marked days by the slow shrinking of their food, by the creak of ice, by the way the light shifted through the snow walls pressed against their cabins. They knew the forlorn hope were out there somewhere, but that knowledge cut two ways. On the good days, it meant rescue might be coming. On the bad days, it meant some of their strongest had walked into a second death instead of staying to help with the first. Babies cried with thin, reedy voices that didn't sound like children anymore. Some stopped crying altogether. Storm after storm rolled through the mountains, sometimes separated by a short, bitterly clear day that let people see just how deep the drifts had become. Inside the shelters, routines congealed into rituals: stoke the fire, scrape the pot, divide the scraps, try to keep everyone moving enough that their muscles wouldn't forget how. People argued less, not because they suddenly got along, but because anger took energy they simply didn't have. Silence grew louder, filled with the sounds of coughing, shallow breathing, and the occasional whispered prayer. Meanwhile, on the far side of everything, James Reed and others were finally pulling together the first rescue party. Men who had never met the Donners or the Reeds agreed to load up packs with food, blankets, and whatever medicines they could scrape together, and to walk straight into some of the worst winter terrain in North America on the word of a desperate man. They knew they might be too late. They went anyway. Each day they delayed meant another day the people in the mountains had to survive on almost nothing. That knowledge rode on their shoulders along with their packs. The forlorn hope, reduced now to a handful of barely recognizable figures, finally staggered down out of the highest drifts and into lower country where the snow thinned. Trees gave way to more open land. The air felt less like broken glass in their lungs. When they saw the first sign of other human life, a faint track, a distant curl of smoke, they almost didn't believe it. They had been walking in a world that felt abandoned by everyone but themselves. The idea that there were still people living normal lives within reach made something buckle inside them. When locals finally found them, this small, frost-burned, starving cluster of strangers, they saw immediately that these weren't just travelers who'd misjudged the weather. They were survivors of something that hadn't ended yet. The forlorn hope told their story in fits and starts, words tripping over each other, leaving out the worst parts and then blurting them in blunt, shocking fragments. Whole families trapped in snow, no food, people dying. The listeners didn't fully understand yet, but they understood enough. If anyone was going to be saved, the effort had to start now. By the time the first relief party reached the Donner camps weeks later, guided by those who'd made it out, winter had carved the people in those cabins down to something raw and barely recognizable. Rescuers were hit with the smell first: smoke, sickness, and the iron-tinged scent of things they didn't want to put names to. They saw children with eyes too old for their faces, adults who could barely lift their heads, and signs that the rumors whispering ahead of them were true. Some of the dead had not been left to rest. The rescuers had known it was bad. Standing there, surrounded by snow walls and hollow faces, they realized they hadn't known the half of it. Getting everyone out wouldn't be a single heroic act. It would take multiple trips up and down the mountain, each one a fight against time, weather, and the survivors' own failing bodies. Some people, when given a chance to leave, were too weak or too entangled in family obligations to go right away. Others clutched at rescuers with bony hands, begging to be taken first, then sobbing when they realized there had to be an order, and not everyone could be at the front of the line. The horror of the Donner Party was no longer just hunger in the dark. It was the realization that even rescue would be uneven, messy, and haunted by the faces of those who didn't make it to a place warm enough to melt the snow from their clothes. By the time the first relief party was inside the cabins, they had to make decisions that would haunt them. There wasn't enough strength, food, or daylight to take everyone at once, So they did something that feels cruel, even when you understand why. They chose. The least sick, the children who could still walk, the adults who might survive the climb, were told to gather what little they owned and be ready to move. Those too weak to stand were promised that another party would come soon, that this wasn't the last chance, that they hadn't been left behind for good, even though, deep down, everyone knew soon in the mountains can mean too late. Leaving the cabins was its own kind of shock. For months, the world had been a cramped, smoky interior where the horizon stopped at a snow-packed wall. Stepping out into the open air, even that thin, freezing air felt wrong to some of the survivors, like stepping onto another planet. Children squinted at the daylight as if it hurt. Behind them, family members too weak to go watched from doorways, their faces half hidden in shadow, trying to be glad for the ones who were leaving, while knowing that every person who walked away was also walking out of their tiny, fragile circle of help. The path out was not a neat line of footprints, it was a slow-motion collapse in progress. Rescuers handed out bits of food, careful not to let starving bodies gorge themselves into shock. Even so, a couple of people faltered, their systems overwhelmed by the sudden taste of something more substantial than boiled leather or scraps of flesh. The climb was brutal, up over drifts, across ice, through wind that cut straight through rags and makeshift shoes. Some of the rescued had to be half-carried, their legs moving more out of memory than strength. Every mile gained was a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. Back at the lake and Alder Creek, the people who'd stayed behind slipped into a strange, suspended state. They had seen the proof that the outside world hadn't forgotten them, strangers with food, news, and the promise of return. But they were still sitting in the same cabins, surrounded by snow, counting the same dwindling scraps. In some ways, that made the hunger worse. Hope can be heavy when your body has nothing left to burn. They listened for the sound of the next party. Voices, footsteps, any human noise cutting through the muffled quiet of constant snow. The second and third rescue parties found scenes that were somehow both better and worse. Better because some cabins had lost fewer people than feared. Worse because the evidence of what starvation does when it has enough time was now impossible to ignore. Bones that weren't from animals, cuts that didn't match the way a surgeon or butcher would work. Rescuers did their jobs anyway, wrapping shivering survivors in blankets, coaxing them to eat carefully, urging them to stand. But later, when they talked about what they'd seen, there were parts they skipped or only hinted at, because saying them too clearly made the images come back sharper. One of the most controversial figures to walk out of those mountains was a man named Louis Kieseberg. He was found late in the relief efforts in a cabin that held more dead than living. Stories would grow around him, accusations that he'd gone beyond using the bodies of those who had already died, that he might have hastened some deaths in the name of survival. He denied the worst of it, admitted to some, and carried those whispers with him for the rest of his life. Whether every accusation was true or not almost stopped mattering. People needed somewhere to put their horror, and he was right there. Not everyone made it out, even with rescue. George Donner, bedridden from a wound that had turned foul, never left Alder Creek. Some adults chose to stay with dying spouses or small children who were too weak to move, trading their own chance of survival for a little more time together in the only home they had left, even if that home was a half-buried shelter in a place that had tried very hard to kill them. The rescuers had to keep walking away from those cabins, hearing voices calling after them, knowing that some of the people they were leaving behind would never walk in their footprints. For the ones who did reach the settlements in the Sacramento Valley, the transition from survival to aftermath was jarring. One week they were chewing boiled hides in the dark. The next, They were sitting in houses where tables bent under the weight of food. Well-meaning strangers pressed bread and meat into their hands and stared while they ate, curiosity and pity mixed in their eyes. Survivors were bathed, clothed, and given beds that didn't move under them. But sleep came hard. In the quiet after the initial wave of relief, memories rushed in to fill the space. News traveled fast, carried by horseback, riverboat, and rumor. California cannibals and horrors in the Sierra made their way into headlines and conversations. Some people reacted with pure disgust, talking about savagery and moral collapse, as if they could guarantee they'd have chosen differently with their own children starving in front of them. Others saw something more complicated. Ordinary families pushed into a corner so tight that the only choices left were all terrible. The Donner Party became a kind of mirror people held up to themselves. What would you have done in that cabin, with that snow outside? Survivors had to live with more than just their own memories. They had to live with the versions other people built. Children grew up with their last name whispered like a curse or a ghost story. Some changed their names, moved, and tried to fold themselves into ordinary life. Others spoke openly about what had happened, refusing to let the story be framed only as a freak show. They talked about the bad shortcut, the lost time, the failures of leadership and planning, about how the horror at the end of the trail had been seeded way back when someone decided a guidebook was more trustworthy than a warning. Over time, the place itself changed names to fit the story. Truckee Lake became Donner Lake. Donner Pass entered maps. Tourists eventually came to stand where the cabins once stood, reading plaques that summarized months of hunger and terror into a few neat paragraphs. They took photos, maybe felt a chill even on a sunny day, and then drove away on paved roads that cut cleanly through the mountains the wagons had once fought for every inch of. The land no longer trapped people, but it didn't exactly let go of what had happened there either. The Donner Party slowly settled into that strange category of history where fact and legend overlap. Historians argued over dates, decisions, and exactly how much cannibalism occurred in which cabin. Novelists and filmmakers took the outline and colored it in with their own shades of horror. Every retelling made choices, what to emphasize, what to soften, what to leave out. But underneath all the versions, the spine of the story stayed the same. Ordinary people chasing a better life, one arrogant shortcut, a winter that came too early, and a set of mountains that didn't care how badly anyone wanted to get through. In the end, the most unsettling part of the Donner story isn't just the cannibalism, it's how normal everything looked at the beginning. Families packing wagons, fathers promising their kids a house under a warmer sun, a book that said, "There's a faster way, trust me." The tragedy didn't fall out of a clear blue sky. It was built step by step out of small decisions that only showed their true weight when the snow came and wouldn't stop. The real horror is realizing how thin the line can be between "we'd never do that" and "we did what we had to do" once the world closes in and refuses to open a door. Because somewhere, under the lake that bears their name and the highway that slices through the pass, those cabins once stood full of people who had believed that courage and hard work could carry them anywhere. The mountains taught them a crueler lesson. Sometimes the land, the weather, and the lies you've been sold team up in a way no amount of grit can fix. What's left behind is not just a cautionary tale about cannibalism in the snow. It's a quieter warning about shortcuts, about hubris, and about how easily a hopeful journey can slide into a horror story if you don't respect the weight of the choices you're making while the weather still seems fine.